Welcome. We're happy you could join us for this New York Times event. As a courtesy to our guests, please silence your cell phones. Most importantly, thank you to all of the Times subscribers who help make these programs possible. Enjoy the event.
Good evening, everyone. How are we all doing? Great. We're so glad you're here tonight. My name is Jeff Orgera. I am Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Retention and Success here at UC San Diego. And on behalf of Chancellor Pradeep Khosla and Executive Vice Chancellor Elizabeth Simmons, I'd like to welcome you all to this New York Times subscriber event, Hollywood and the Artist Gaze on Vets. I'm really excited about our panelists and that you've taken some time to join us this evening. And we're so excited to host this event and work with the Times and to have all of you here on this campus for several different reasons, bless you. The U.S. Navy and their Camp Matthews is where you are right now. So this campus really was gifted to us by the U.S. Navy. And, our history is really strongly tied to the military. And more than 1 million Marines completed training here on this campus, as it was known as Camp Matthews. And this base was from 1917 to 1964. And in 1964, the Navy gifted this land to UC San Diego, and that's when our campus started. So we have a long tradition with the military, and it's also exciting because according to the U.S. Census, San Diego County is home to the country's third largest veteran population. And on top of it all, the reason why I'm here tonight is that in my role working on retention and success, I have the opportunity to lead our Student Veterans Resource Center. So that center started on this campus in 2012. And we have over 1,600 military-affiliated students currently studying on this campus right now. So that is the highest number in the UC system. We're really proud of that. And we're just excited to have you all here. So a couple of quick things that you may or may not know. We were founded, UC San Diego, as an experimental campus in 1960 and shaped by scholars who were ready to take risks and break things better and be entrepreneurial and really explore boundaries that they ended up breaking. Today we're ranked one of the top 15 research universities in the world and the #1 public university in the U.S. for social mobility. And this is a ranking that myself and my colleagues in senior leadership are really proud of, meaning we bring lots of students to this campus who are first in their families to attend college and maybe are low-income students, and we graduate them, and they go off and change the world, not only their own lives, the lives of their families and their communities. So just a little bit of information there. Also, this year we enrolled one of our largest classes. Almost 9,500 new students started with us on this campus just about a week ago, and we're now over 38,000 students on the campus here. So I mentioned our Student Veterans Resource Center, and I'd like to give you just a little bit of information about that organization. I mentioned the 1,600 students, military affiliated. 85% of them are transfer students. Okay, so these students are older students, average age of 36 years old. So coming to a campus that's predominantly 18 to 22-year-olds is really an interesting transition for them, on top of the idea of transitioning from the military to civilian life to a public Research One campus. So the work that we do in the Veterans Resource Center really focuses on academic transition and academic support, social and emotional support, and then just navigational transition with VA benefits or VOC rehab or you name it. So we're really, we feel like we're at the top of our game in this work, but having you all here tonight, we're open for input and feedback along the way. So without further ado, I'd like to mention one other program we're really proud of out of our Office of Research Affairs. And VC Brown, my colleague Sandra Brown, she's been working with a few organizations to help veterans as they transition to create their own businesses. So we have a veteran entrepreneur initiative that we're rolling out and has rolled out on the campus. And basically we have people available to work with our veterans to take their ideas, help them bring them to market, start small businesses, just as another means to help transition into civilian life. So I want to thank all of you for those of you who've served, and thank you for being here tonight. And I'm really excited about our panel. We have an amazing group of artists and veterans, and some of them are both. And please join me in welcoming them. And I'm going to pass this to Jennifer Steinhauer, our editor for live journalism for the New York Times. So thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to be with you in Southern California tonight to talk about one of the more pressing and at times underappreciated policy issues of our times, how our nation grapples with veterans. I would like to give a special thanks to welcome to New York Times subscribers, and thank you for what you do to help our journalism happen. This evening's event has been brought to you by the New York Times Subscriber Events Program, which brings our readers behind the stories at our newspaper. Thank you for the university for partnering with us. As of 9/11, men and women can join the military and fight in wars that started before they were born. What accounts for the gulf between the minority of Americans who have served our country and civilians who may not understand the full costs of a generation of war? And what role has the artist's lens played in our understanding of these issues? Tonight we hope to unpack all of this with Chris Chivers, a Times journalist and Marine Corps infantry veteran who won a Pulitzer Prize for his 2016 story about an Afghan war veteran's travails, as well as Jason Hall, an Academy Award nominee for his screenplay for Whitney's work.
calls, and I really appreciated that the story told in Fearless, because it was a really honest, completely unexpected, non-cliched experience that I was totally not expecting. And I've watched it 3 times, and I have to stop it just to clear my head. And I'm not somebody who cries, but it brings me to tears. So it was just an unexpected film.
Max, you and I have talked about this line between stereotypes and reality when it comes to the portrayals of the military community and veterans in art. How is your work challenging that?
I don't know. I mean, I try to sort of, so I do a few different things. Terminal Lance is sort of what I'm most known for. And in that, I try to delve into the humor of being in the Marine Corps. And I think in a lot of ways, Terminal Lance has been able to break some of the stereotypical barriers that are typical of a sort of Marine culture that people think of. When I think of Marines, I think of like structure and discipline and like these really honorable things. And I like to sort of tear those walls down and show it for what it kind of really is, which is just kind of a shit show in a lot of ways. So I think if I'm challenging any stereotypes, it's just that I like to show the Marine Corps as it really is. And the problem then is that the stereotype is that it's often portrayed as it's not really. It's usually portrayed as a sort of PAO-approved idea of what the Marine Corps and what the military is, and I don't like that. So I think a lot of the public gets sort of misconceptions about the military and veterans and Marines and the people that are active duty. So I just like to be as honest as I can be about it, and I think that's more important than anything else. And with Terminal Lance, all I really try to do is be honest about what I saw, how Marines behave, how sometimes it's not okay, sometimes there are different ways that we can approach things and look at things and try to really challenge the Marines themselves to look at themselves in a different light, to try to, help them in some ways, I guess. I don't know. Or just make them laugh. That's important too.
One thing I wanted to say about Max's work that I like too is that I grew up watching MASH, Mr. Roberts, McHale's Navy, all these comedies. That was how I understood the military. And it seems like there aren't comedies it doesn't seem like there's the same sense of humor, and we're not able to laugh about the military.
Yeah, I think that kind of came with the post 9/11 generation, where it was I remember growing up and seeing MASH and all this stuff. Those are all Vietnam era kind of things, where it was it sort of portrayed the military as these kind of bumbling idiots, which isn't true either. But then when the 9/11 era kind of came into it, it became very taboo to make fun of the military or not portray it in a kind of positive, again, PAO kind of approved light. So I try to break that barrier with it. But yeah, I don't know.
Chris, do you think that journalism also has a role in shaping the public perception of military and veterans?
Well, sure, because, we, talk with and interact with the rank and file, and we're often at the places and the locations where the wars are being fought. And we create some of what becomes the foundation of the first discourse about the wars that others draw from. So, like we saw with the picture of Juan, or the painting of Juan, where you'll see a lot of other films and that will in the future draw from initial journalistic accounts. We kind of create the research base that is outside of the system, again, outside of the PAO. What I like about Max's work is it recognizes that most of the Marine Corps is aged 18 to 24. Most of the people speaking for the Marine Corps are in their 30s or above. They're the lifers, and they're very different than the actual Corps that they're speaking for. And it's like a triangle, but it's like a really flat triangle. Most of it is in the bottom, and it has no voice of its own, or a little voice of its own. And Max has captured that. Journalists also can operate down in that space, down in that lower space.
It's the best space to be, trust me. It's way more fun in that space.
And can create the beginning of the conversation that becomes art. And some of the best journalism, particularly photography, rises to the level of art, absolutely, and creates incredibly economic, enduring pieces of work that are thick with ideas and will be interpreted for decades, if not generations. So sure, we have a role, but ours is the first role, nowhere near the last role.
This is just kind of a tangent, but I recently did a speech at a Lance Corporal graduation seminar. The Marine Corps does this thing now called Lance Corporal's course, and like they teach you how to clean or something. I don't really know what they do, but
How to clean toilets?
yeah, right. They just put you on a working party. I got invited to go speak at the graduation ceremony, and so in that speech, though, I told them that Lance Corporals are and will forever be my favorite rank in the Marine Corps because they still have that little piece of themselves left in them. You know, they haven't given their souls away to the Marine Corps quite yet. I feel like, you know, I don't know how many of you are Marines in here, but there's this thing.
A lot, I think.
So when you're a staff NCO, you can wear this, what's that coat called? The like half coat? I always forget. The mess dress, yeah. I feel like, and no offense if you're a staff NCO, but I feel like once you are like at the PX eyeballing that mess dress going, should I spend my money on that? Your soul has already left your body a long time ago. Like it's just gone. It's just totally gone at that point in time. So the Lance Corporal space is definitely the best space to be. I feel like that's the realest part of the military that you're going to find.
And it's probably the part where most of the art's going to come from going forward.
I think so, too.
There will be great books written about colonels and pilots and the like, but there will be much, much more that comes from the Lance Corporals, the specialists, the privates first class, for sure. Because that's the real thing.
Much funnier stuff, at least.
Jason, I want to go back to you and ask you, if you looked at the films out of World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and compared those to some of the films that have come out about the post-9/11 wars, what are some of the defining traits of those films? Have you seen it change over history, or are there still certain qualities that Hollywood is capturing in these films despite the wars changing?
Yeah, that's a hard question. You know, a film that we looked at before making Thank You for Your Service was Best Years of Our Lives, which is probably, like all things being equal, probably one of the best war films ever made, if not the best war film ever made, just because its incorporation. I'm gonna forget his name. There's an actor in it who was a veteran who had lost an arm, and he plays his own character. What's his? I'm gonna kill him. Do you know his name? Someone just whispered his name. Homer. Yes. He plays a character in this movie, and he is that character basically. And it follows these guys home. It follows 3 of them home, and there's such an honesty and an economy to the film that it's. You know, you watch it, and it's 3 hours long, and it's you live with these guys in a way that I haven't seen in any other film. I like the films that are a little bit less emotional and more documentary. I like there is a bit of this. You know, the amount of time that has passed from the war determines the war film, right? And you can't make fun of the things that happened or have comedy until, I think there's like a 10, 11-year rule until there can be any sort of postmodernism from anything, right? And so, you know, the amount of time that passes, I don't know, I can't, I'm hard-pressed to think of any Korean War films. I'm sure that someone out there is going to scream one right now, but there's not a lot of Korean War films, and there's not a lot of, you know, there's not a ton of Desert Storm films, but there's an honesty that comes from the passage of time, from a real examination, a clear-headed examination of what went on, and so I think that you know, it's easier to make a World War II movie now than it was, you know, 20 years ago. Same with a Vietnam film. But I also think there's a shelf life on some of those things.
Dave, do you think that we'll ever have films that make the same type of statements that The Deer Hunter or Apocalypse Now made, which came out at a time when there was a climate in the country that really was impacted by those films? Do you think that we can have a film that's come out about the post 9/11 wars that would have that same legacy?
I think that's the open question. I think the source material has to be there. I mean, I was thinking when you were talking, I was thinking of From Here to Eternity, which was a really scathing, controversial film, and the studio didn't want to make it, and it went on to become an iconic film because it was problematic because it showed the corruption in the peacetime army and a lot of the really harsh living conditions. But I think it takes commitment, and I think you have to have the source material. And I think Vietnam is just a really tough. I watched Coming Home and The Deer Hunter a couple weeks ago, and I think just the nature of the culture now, because we don't have a draft, and I teach at a university, and identity politics is sort of part of my daily life, and the veteran, in a weird way that I did not anticipate when I went in the Marine Corps, the veteran has kind of become sort of this special, this small population, and it's not really, it doesn't speak to the culture in the same way that the drafted and the riots and the anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s. So I think it's sort of an open question what happens next, because I don't know. There's this, in some cases I think, and some of the filmmakers I've talked to, there's a concern about, one of the first questions that filmmakers seem to ask is, who am I? I'm uncredentialed. I'm just a person who makes films. I don't know anything about the military. How do I tell a story that will be interesting to people? And then hard on the heels of that, the next question is, how do I do that respectfully? And I think for me, I've never made a film. I don't know anything about making films, honestly. But for me as a writer, when I'm starting on a piece, and I'm a vet, so I get special privileges. I can write. People won't. Veteran writing is sort of graded on a curve. You get special privileges because you're writing about. I mean, honestly, I have veterans that I read their work, and we are given special privileges because which I think makes sense. But if I was trying to write a short story or work on a piece that I wanted to be true, and I think art works when it's true, not just when it's pleasing. I think you have to show, you have to not worry too much about, is this going to be honor and respect and be properly respectful of the subject matter? I mean, that's a consideration, but, like Apocalypse Now or The Thin Red Line, I think movies that are my personal favorites, like Apocalypse Now, I think the series of questions that Francis Coppola was asking himself was not, how do I honor, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne or the Special Forces, Green Berets of the time. He was trying to tell a story. But talking about Apocalypse Now is interesting because I read relatively recently that Tim O'Brien, who is arguably the most important novelist from Vietnam, he hated that movie, which was weird because I grew up just being around it, and Apocalypse Now was like the ultimate war movie. And so it was funny to hear that somebody that I also really admired, who was an artist of the highest caliber, just hated Apocalypse Now. So I think there's...
Hates it or hated it?
Just thought it was,
Still does.
Did not like it, thought it was this surrealist, had nothing to do with his experience, thought it was weird, didn't really reflect his experience of Vietnam at all. And so, and Tim O'Brien's somebody that's
Sure.
He's not like a closed-minded, like it needs to be ABC kind of person. So I was surprised because to me that was an iconic work, and somebody who's an iconic artist, there's been disagreement about that. So I think that's sort of the open question, is how do you make something that speaks to not just maybe the moment that we're in or speaks to a particular story, but says something about the nature of war and the nature of basically the universe, because war is built into the nature of the universe. We're built. There are opposites that are built into the molecular structure of the universe. So, which I thought interestingly comes across in the Thin Red Line, this idea that man is an expression of nature, but nature in and of itself is always at war with itself. There's always a process of life, death, and decay, which feeds life again. And so, the early pre-Socratic Greek philosophers spoke of this harmony of opposites, and that was some of the oldest Western philosophy derives and builds on this idea. And so, for me, this is one reason why. I left the Marine Corps. I had a completely unremarkable career. Left 20 years ago, and I still find myself writing about it because, it's my family. I'm from San Diego. It's everything I've ever known, and it's also it gives you a window into really basic human questions, and they're questions that you can wrestle with for decades.
I think that that point of reverence, requiring reverence in military media is so important. I don't know if you'll remember the show Enlisted that was on Fox. It lasted one season. And the showrunners invited me out to work on the show, and I was there for like a week. But I came in pretty late into the season, and I only got to work on like the last episode. And I found that that show, everybody on the show was amazing. Loved working with everybody. But the problem with that show was they were so worried about reverence. They were so worried about not upsetting the veteran community that they didn't push it far enough. And in my experience with Terminal Lance, most Marines don't care that much about it. As long as you're honest, they don't care if you make fun of it. Like, it's more about just being honest and genuine with it. And you can't do that if you have this constant fear of reverence for the military. If you're just constantly like, we got to honor stuff, we can't say anything bad, because if we do that, then someone on Fox News is going to get on there and just start screaming at us, and they're going to go on a rant, they're going to boycott Starbucks. And you can't worry about that because real art comes from honesty more than anything else. So.
But do you get hate mail too? Do you ever get angry? How much angry mail do you get? That's the question.
I don't. I surprisingly don't get a lot of angry
those
mail.
all caps ones?
No,
all like 6 paragraphs of all caps.
No, we get them at the Times.
But
they go to you.
Deer Hunter is, I would also agree, I don't know what you think about Deer Hunter, but Deer Hunter to me is like real art. And then you hear the history of Deer Hunter was originally a spec script that was about a gambler who went to Vegas and he would gamble, and then when that wasn't enough, he started playing Russian roulette. So the filmmakers, Michael Cimino, said, yeah, why don't we take this Russian roulette idea and we'll put it in Vietnam? And that worked great. No truth whatsoever. And then it becomes this movie that really says something and speaks to everybody about a war. So sometimes I think you can start from the outside in,
Right. I think it's a lot to do with truth, not necessarily truth to the military experience, but truth to the human experience. And I think that that's something that a lot of military writers and filmmakers, they miss because they have such a reverence for the military that they don't think about it from a human perspective. They're not able to look at it impartially, and that really affects the writing of what you're going forward with. Because ultimately, the military is just a human experience. And when you go through it, when you're the one going through it, you're going through boot camp and all this stuff, you're seeing it from a base of normality that is really different from if you're just trying to study it from the outside. So it's informed differently depending on who's sort of looking at it,
Well, and I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of filmmakers, especially in Hollywood, are worried. Like Hollywood has the reputation of being left-leaning. This is what my dad gives me this. My dad, like his window into the world is through Fox News.
Too, yeah.
So the concern is like I think people are ready to accuse Hollywood filmmakers of being libtards or liberals or people who are out of touch with real America, right?
Boycott Starbucks.
So So it seems like that to me is a tricky balance to worry about.
I don't have to worry about that, because everyone thinks I'm super far right now because I did American Sniper. I'm like the rightest of right. I had an interview for NPR, and they're like, we can't have an interview with that guy. He did that crazy rhetoric thing, American Sniper. It was dangerous. And the difference between that, the difference on that movie there's one shot in that movie that determines what that movie is, and a bullet comes out of his gun towards the enemy sniper, and when I talked to Chris, he was like, yeah, I took a shot at the guy. I don't know. Could have hit him. And that's what I put in the script. It just takes the shot and it just kind of goes into oblivion. And then, Clint got the script and he's like, yeah, so I think he's going to hit him. And then I see it and it's like, this bullet, this just, and I'm like, no. And the audience loved it. The audience loved it. They roared the first time I saw it with an audience. And I was like, oh, the slowest bullet in the history of bullets, And here it comes, and everybody just roared. They're laughing at the baby, but they roared at the bullet. There's a fake baby in the movie. It was terrible. Anyway, yeah. Was there a question there?
I just want to hear more
I
of
was
the
just
film.
hijacking
Yeah.
the panel here.
Chris, I want to go back to you. So you have recently published a book that traces the history of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan through a handful of service members while they're over there. Why was now the time for this book to come out? The wars are not over. Most of these guys that are in the book are out, but why was now?
Well, my publisher would like to know that too, but they wanted the book 2 or 3 years ago. Now is when I got it done. And it took more than, we hoped to do it in like 3 years, but it took about 7. Kind of like the 10 or 11-year rule that you were talking about. That just doesn't exist in the culture, but some version of that exists in the processing time of people who've been to war. It takes a while for people to reckon with themselves and their own memories and their social circle. And so candor, you think candor is between two people, right? Like I'm talking with you and now we're talking straight. We have candor. But it also exists in your own head. And a lot of these veterans weren't ready even to acknowledge or process their own experiences. It took 5 and 6 years. And they're people who, when I started and first met them, I met people going way back early in the wars. So I'd known many of these people more than 10 or 12 years and others less than that. When I met them, they presented in a certain way. And over time that changed. And they're people who I thought were doing really well. And as I got to know them more and more, right up to the deadline of the book, more was coming out. They were sharing more things that they hadn't expressed yet. So it took time. It published now. It would be better if it publishes probably, if it were to publish 2 years more into the future, because there'd be more candor, but we had to come out at some point. And I think that we'll see this in art too. I think the art's just really getting going. There's a lot of good art now. But I went back and looked like some of the seminal works in words that we talk about from Vietnam. Like what did you say, right? Things They Carry, Tim O'Brien. You know when it came out?
1990.
1990.
Wow.
15 years after
Wow.
Saigon. 15 years. We're nowhere near that yet with Afghanistan and Iraq. Or, something that channels a more negative impression of the Marine Corps and make no effort at reverence, but it feels really honest. Matterhorn, right?
2008?
Yeah, 2010. Came out in 2010, maybe a little before that. Maybe when I looked it up, I looked up the paperback version, so maybe it's 2008, 2009. But that book dismantles the idea that the Marine Corps knew what they were doing above like the PFC or Lance Corporal level. The colonels are drunk. The colonel has them build a series of bunkers on the side of a hill to hold, and they change their mind. They leave the bunkers. The Vietnamese move into the bunkers. They have to attack these almost impregnable positions they made themselves, and they suffer terribly in the attack. The Marine Corps is so fucked up in that book that the guy who goes to frag someone kills the wrong guy because they've switched bunks. 35 years after the end of the war, right? Maybe the best book about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, maybe that will become the basis for the best movies, will come out 10 years after I'm dead. We're just getting going.
My CO was also a drunk. Just throwing that out there. No, he really was. I'm not making this up.
In Iraq?
In Iraq, he was
Yeah.
drunk. So like it was a dry country. Obviously, we weren't allowed to have alcohol, so people would mail alcohol, and it would get intercepted by the command. And he stockpiled it in his can, and he.
Oh my God.
I have a video of him drunk in the back of our MRAP singing. Like splayed out across all of us because there wasn't enough room in the MRAP. It was already full, and he needed a ride, so he just like laid down on top of us, and he's drunk as hell, just singing some song. He was a drunk. My CO was a drunk.
And this probably informs Terminal Lance,
It
right?
does, yeah.
he
It was a shit
dismantles
show.
them at
It
the-
was
the-
a
the-
shit show.
Your
yeah,
company
the-
commander?
My company commander, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Good times. Anyway. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Yeah.
Tangent.
I'm very distracted by this dog. He's very adorable. I love his vest. It looks great. He's very tactical.
Max, I want to ask you, how has your art changed over the course of first getting out and getting into illustrating with Terminal Lance, and it's taken a more serious turn with White Donkey? What was that evolution? What was the reason for it?
So there's kind of like two parts to what I do with Terminal Lance. There's like the literal art of drawing it and stuff, which has also changed. And then there's the writing. And it's funny, if you look back at Terminal Lance from when it launched in 2010 to like now, you can see my like evolution as like a moto stupid veteran in college, writing about how annoying college students are, and then me just getting like disillusioned and angry, and then me kind of not caring anymore. It's gone through a lot of different like ups and downs of my kind of attitudes toward it all. And it's funny because as I've done Terminal Lance over the years, as I've gotten further and further away from it, and I've met other veterans that are further and further away from it, it's funny how people kind of forget how much they hated it, and then as they get further away from it, they start getting nostalgic. You know, that nostalgia comes in. It's like, man, wasn't it great when we were in Iraq? Just us guys, you know, just bro time. And it's like, yeah, but it was also like 115 degrees, and we all hated it every second of it, and we all wish we could not be there, like, at that time. Like, that was literally all we were thinking about was going home. And so Chris Shivers comes over to my house months ago when he was doing a New York Times piece on me, and it was so refreshing to hear how disgruntled he was. Because I find that as I've gotten further away, I'm surrounded by a lot of people that are like, yeah, the Marine Corps, man, it's not that bad. And then Chris comes around, he's all like, oh, those fucking assholes. And I was just like, wow, this is great. I haven't heard this in a while. And then it brought me back.
Do you drink, Chris? No. Okay. No.
And I found that nostalgia, I gained nostalgia for it as I get further and further out. But I remember when I was back in, I hated it. I absolutely hated it from the moment I got on the Yellow Footprints. I hated every second of it. I was like, oh, God, I'm counting the 364 days left. Or, 3 years, 364 days left on the moment I got to boot camp. And I did a research trip. So I'm working on a new book right now, a new graphic novel, and it takes place in Afghanistan in the mountains. So my wife wouldn't let me go to Afghanistan, but for research, I thought I would go to Bridgeport, which is where the Marine Corps has their mountain warfare training facility. And someone's lost. So I go to Bridgeport, and I hadn't really been around real active duty Marines in a long time. I'd been out for a long time. So I go there, and the Marine Corps is super cool about letting me do this. I don't know why they were, but they were. So I'm like, hey, I want to go to Bridgeport and hang out in the field with these Marines for a few days. And they're like, sure, dude, come on out. So I drive up to Bridgeport, and it's this miserable little base in the mountains. And I get there, and they take me up to the mountain. And I'm talking to the lance corporals in the infantry. There were I think 3 or 4 different battalions training there. And they all train there for like a month before they go to Afghanistan. It's like a requirement. So I go up there, and as soon as I get there, this gunny comes up to me. I just got off the truck. I'm up on the mountain. It's like a base camp thing. It's all snowy everywhere. And this gunny comes up to me, and he's all like, you're Max, right? Terminal Lance. And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, have you shit in a bucket yet? And I was like, no, I haven't. He's like, bro, you got to shit in the bucket. It's an experience. You got to shit in the bucket. And I was like, okay, thanks, man. And then, then I'm talking to these Lance Corporals, and they were telling me that the day before I got there, they had been stuck kind of just on this base with nothing to do for like 10 days, and they had 3 suicide attempts the day before I got there. And every Marine that I talked to hated their life so much, and it brought it all back. I was like, yeah, now I remember why the fuck I got out, because this sucks, and nobody wants to be here. This is horrible. Why would anyone choose to do this to themselves? This is the worst thing ever. So it really refreshed a lot of my hatred and a lot of my a lot of my anger. So it was good. I think it was good for me to go on that trip and do that. But as the humor in Terminal Lance has shifted a lot. It went from kind of like veteran humor to me kind of like thinking more about my time and how I would feel as an active duty Lance Corporal. And that's kind of the mode that I have to get into when I write these jokes now, is like, I am Lance Corporal Max now. What do I hate today about this experience? And so that's sort of where the humor has to kind of derive from. So I don't know if that answered your question at all.
It was sort of there. We're going to actually open it up to questions now. There are going to be ushers on either side with microphones. And we just ask that you please ask questions and refrain from making long statements that don't end in a question mark. So do we have any questions?
Have any of you seen the movie with Brad Pitt, War Machine? It was just a Netflix movie. I'd just be interested in your reaction to it.
I have actually not seen it. It's one of those movies I keep meaning to watch, and I have not gotten to yet.
I try not to watch anything on Netflix. I hate Netflix. As a general principle.
So I was given an early passcode to watch an advanced copy, and I watched it with a Marine who was in Marja, which is where the scene, or most of the scenes, or the central scenes of the movie occur. And I happened to be in Marja with a different unit, and he was unable to finish it. He didn't want to keep watching. He just thought it didn't bear much resemblance to the experience. So we didn't. I mean, he was critiquing it like the scenes looked like Iraq, not like Afghanistan. And there was a scene with a civilian casualty. And he's like, well, we didn't need to make up this scene. We killed a lot of civilians at Marja in the first couple of days, and the real materials was there. And it was the scene that was in there was actually much less than what had happened. And we ended up, he was up at my house, we were fishing, and we ended up calling it and not completing it. It's not to say it's a good movie, because I haven't seen the whole thing. I can't really comment on it. I think it was just too close to our own experiences, and we walked away from it.
Question about Ken Burns' Vietnam. I watched like 3 of them and I gave up. I couldn't handle it. How about you guys?
I love that film series. My dad was in Vietnam and floated the first group of Marines over in '65 and landed in Da Nang. My dad and I don't talk about politics because he gets too angry, and he doesn't talk. I mean, I look at Fox News as basically ruined my family, and my dad just doesn't talk about the war, and he had a very small part in the war, and we don't talk about it because I'll get upset. And I would come and go from Iraq, and we would talk about Iraq, and I would try to tell him, like I remember emailing him from Camp Fallujah, and I emailed him, I said, Dad, I think you don't realize that Rumsfeld is a lot like McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during Vietnam. And my dad, he didn't answer me back. So we've had like just like decades of not talking about stuff that, matters to us a lot. And then I watched some of the Ken Burns documentary, really liked it. I agree with you though, it's hard to watch. And so I just gave it to my dad for Christmas. And he started talking about Vietnam, and it brought stuff out. He hadn't thought about it in years and years and years, and we'd never talked about it. I gave him Tim O'Brien, I gave him Matterhorn. I give him every good war. He gets a war novel every Christmas. And I was really pleased, and it was really cathartic to see my dad, who just will not go there. And the film, I think, especially for me, the last episode, the last disc in the series, starts with Tim O'Brien and ends with Tim O'Brien. And I just personally found it to be really, meaningful. And my dad had never spoken, and he's like, I don't know what we were doing there. That was just, I didn't know anything that stuff. I didn't know about the French were there before us, and we never should have been there. And he had all of these feelings. And my dad doesn't do feelings, and so it was really awesome. I think that's a documentary that took centuries to finish. Ken Burns said he kept pushing the deadline, But, the Greeks talked about catharsis. That's where we get that word, which was in drama. The Greeks would do a play, and it would have a medical effect on Greek veterans. They would be able to let go of the traumatic feelings. And so I feel like that is a case of a film having a substantial democratic, emotional, medical impact on my dad. So for me that's a case study in what film can do.
It's so hard to make any movie. It's what they say is it's hard to make a bad movie, meaning it's still hard to make a really bad movie. So to make a good movie and to make a good movie that's 12, 13 hours, it's like woof. I can't. The amount of work Ken Burns does in those docs is absolutely insane. But even when you were talking about the Brad Pitt movie, to make anything look like Iraq, that's a huge victory. It's so hard to do any movie, and so I think that gets forgotten. We were setting out. We had one scene to shoot that was supposed to be Iraq. It was like Humvees and this and that, and it was a couple days. Right before that, the attack in France happened. We were set to go to Jordan. Then it was like, you're done. You're not going to Jordan. You're not going to Morocco. You're not going anywhere. You're shooting Iraq in Atlanta. And it was like, we had to walk through the paces of holy crap, we have to shoot Iraq in Atlanta. And so you're like, all right, is it going to be wood? Is it going to be stucco? Is it going to be, what are we going to do? How are we going to get this? How are we going to get these surfaces? Oh, and then this is visual effects, and we're going to extend on green screen, and everything's going to be this. And you're just like, and then what? We're going to put Latin kids in the street? What are we going to do? And you go through this thing of oh my God. And I managed to outmaneuver some of the people that were above me and get to the people above them. And Spielberg was very excited to hear that I really wanted to go to Jordan. And the people below him were very pissed off that I'd called him myself and reminded him that he knew the king of Jordan. And then it was then it was they were like, you're still not going to Jordan, you'll go to Morocco. And I was like, great, Morocco it is, better than Atlanta, But the entire film and its authenticity hinged on a decision by people, not myself, who was, the director and writer of the film. And it's all of these other people that are like, that's not going to look good for me. That doesn't go with our insurance company isn't going to allow that. They're not going to put these people on Humvees and the thing and the thing and the thing. Nope, sorry. And all of your intention, all of this, it took me 2.5, 3 years to write that movie. And all of this momentum, all of this stuff gets decided by someone else, not yourself. And so it doesn't matter how much good intention you have, how much goodwill, how much you put into it, it can still be derailed because it's a film. And you didn't pay for it with your own money, And so, I have a lot more latitude now for filmmakers, and I make a smart aleck comment about Netflix, but, I have a lot more latitude for any film getting made at all is a big achievement. And I know there are a lot of filmmakers with really good intentions who just, if you hit one snag, that's all it takes. All it takes is one person being like, you're not going over there. They had a terror thing, and I heard it's not safe. And then you're done, Iraq looks like Atlanta. Ruins the film for everybody.
Question in the back.
You guys have talked a lot tonight about kind of tiptoed around what I think maybe is an important discussion, and that's the kind of growing chasm between civilian understanding of the veteran experience and this kind of separation of our community from the civilian experience to some extent. You've talked about it as part of a way that maybe respect in movies is hard to achieve, or we're too overly worried about it. or veteran artists have a pass, but maybe other artists don't. How do we overcome that? And how do we get those communities bridged together? And what's the role of art and writing in that process?
I personally, my personal opinion on that subject, because it gets brought up a lot, the veteran, military, civilian divide. It's always this thing. It's like, it's got its own name, you know, it's like, it's a thing. I feel like a lot of veterans put the onus on the civilians. Like, oh, they got to understand us, you know, why don't they understand us? And it's like, well, technically, we're part of the 1% or whatever it is of America that went and did this weird, crazy thing that was 100% voluntary that none of us had to do. And so you have to understand that, like, for veterans, like, we're the ones that went through this crazy experience. We're the ones that did this to ourselves, and it's up to us to kind of come back down from that extraordinary level and be like, this is what it was like. It's really up to us to tell them what it was like. I don't put the onus on civilians at all to understand what the military experience is like. And I think a lot of veterans don't consider that enough, and they get very, they're very prideful about it, and they get very angry when they try to think like, oh, but they don't understand us. And it's like, well, you gotta make them understand, man. You gotta put it out there, and you gotta be honest with yourself about the real experience, and not, you know, make things up, not like embellish, not, you know, don't let your pride get in the way of being honest. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, maybe I think an answer to that question might be that's because artists we're not doing our fucking jobs good enough to actually get people to understand the experience. Yeah, that's a tough one, because I think this is what happens when you don't have a draft. And, you know, history, the reason that we don't have a draft in the United States is because President Nixon ended it. Why did President Nixon end the draft? Not because he loved the all-volunteer military. He ended the draft because there were protests on campus. I didn't know this until I started research. In 1971, a undergraduate, I forget his name, immolated himself about a quarter mile from here, right near the library, over the American invasion of Cambodia. There was this very strong visceral connection that was a phenomenon of the Vietnam generation that just does not exist anymore. And I don't know. Part of it, I think, is the art and the movies and the novels and the books that we need to get busy finishing. One of us has finished a book this year. But I think, yeah, I agree with Max. I think it's partly because we suck a little bit, and we're not doing, like, you know, there's like, you know, I don't have that many good stories, but I know a lot of Marines that sort of expect to have their asses kissed, and they hang out at a bar, and they want to be treated a certain way, and you need to go and help people understand your experience. That's one of the reasons I ended up being a writer, I think, is I went to Texas A&M. I was in a military school. Half of my friends were civilian, half of them were military, and I always had to explain what the uniform was, what's going on, what's up with A Few Good Men. Can you really, you know, call a code red on that guy? And so you end up I thought that was a really interesting way. I grew up just because I had a lot of really liberal friends and just people that were, you know, hippies and, you know, yoga nerds, and so it was very useful for me. And I think that's one reason I love San Diego and California, is that you end up ping-ponging with, you know, complete weirdos, hippies and surfers and people that are way out on the left, and you have to explain yourself to them and explain, you know, what it was like. So I guess, yeah, I just agree with Max.
I mean, I feel like I've had the benefit of being on the other side of that, where I've gotten emails, and I've, you know, not that I was responsible for it, but I've gotten emails that said, you know, I remember this one I got after Sniper, where this lady on Facebook, I just started accepting friends, which ended up being a very bad decision down the road. But in retrospect, very, very poor decision. My friends and friends of friends all were like, whoa, what happened? But this woman reached out to me, and she said, you know, I want to thank you for your movie. My husband went to Vietnam. When he came home, he had nightmares. I would wake up and he'd have his hands around my neck, trying to kill me. He hasn't talked about the war since. He came home. Tonight we saw American Sniper, and on the way home, he talked about the war for the very first time. And thank you for that, because that changed our marriage and might have saved his life. And I was just, that was my best experience in making that movie, was that email from this woman on Facebook. Like, a lot of great stuff happened. I didn't feel any of it. I felt that, And being the recipient of a couple of those emails was by far the greatest artistic feeling I've ever experienced. The greatest benefit of all this fucking nonsense work and sitting at a computer for hours and hours and hours, like feeling that you connected even just to one person, even to this one lady who I'll never meet. Like, that connection was the greatest benefit I've experienced in art.
Juan, do you have a question?
Yes. So, to piggyback off of the civilian-military divide.
Oh, shit. I don't know what that was.
One thing that I've noticed with our generation of veterans is that the military-civilian divide is a double-edged sword, and I feel like we are guilty of further expanding that divide. Would you gentlemen say that you agree with that statement? In your experiences, have you noticed that with our generation of veterans?
I like that point, because I feel like a lot of veterans have not been honest with their experience, and that affects how it's portrayed. And when I was working on The White Donkey, to get back to her question, I totally didn't answer, but when I was working on The White Donkey, my graphic novel, that to me, when I was working on that book, was really me being so brutally real with myself, to the point where I was putting things in the book that were just intensely personal, and it became a very dramatic tale. And I remember General Neller, the current commandant of the Marine Corps, read the book, and he calls me, and I was like, "So what do you think of the book?" And he's like, "It was disturbing." And I was like, that was great though. Like, I loved that answer, because to me, to be disturbed by it meant that it did something. It impacted him, because he was so not used to seeing veterans tell that story in a way that is real and potentially negative, and maybe not pro-war, and not super nostalgic about it. So I think veterans need to be more honest. And this is just my own, personal experience, but we're all Facebook friends with our guys that we were in Iraq with or whatever, and my deployments were boring as hell. I was there, it wasn't anything crazy. But then I see these guys that I was there with, who I know went through the same shit. I know exactly what they did. And they're posting on Facebook like, "Oh, the 22 a day, you guys. Oh my God, you guys, what's going on?" Just to get stupid. They just get so stupid about it. And I'm like, you were there with me. I was there. Nothing crazy happened. You didn't do anything crazy. I don't know why you're on about this. like you are some war hero or something. And it's like, I think the veterans need to bring it back down a little bit and just be real with the experience. But they get inflated expectations of what their experience is supposed to be from the people before them and people around them that are going, "Oh, you went to Iraq, wasn't it crazy? Didn't you kill a bunch of people and all this shit?" So they feel challenged in their own expectations and needing to live up to that in a lot of ways. So then they embellish and they do whatever. So yeah, I think veterans need to be a little bit more honest in a lot of ways.
Well, I think that comes from the top a little bit. General Kelly, Trump's chief of staff, got out at the podium a couple months ago and said, "Well, we all look down on you. We look down on civilians that haven't had the privilege to serve like we had," which I thought was, I'd never served with General Kelly. I just thought it was a really counterproductive thing to say, because he was just condescending to civilians, saying, "Well, you'll never get it. You're not good enough to get it." Basically, was what I took from it, which I think one thing I try to tell civilians is, or not civilians, but friends, is just, people will say, "Well, I could never understand what you go through," and that's just totally not true. It's a human experience. You can explore military. It's not like you're it's not as if I was born on Mars and then I was beamed down into Marine Blues uniform. I'm a human being like you. That you have feelings and impulses and things that you can recognize in the military experience. So I think to people are making the military people the other, or exoticizing service is not good for anybody. It's bad for democracy, basically. It really undermines this is not what George Washington wanted.
Yeah, it's incredible we
George
even have to
Washington.
have this discussion, right? Like, why are we, as veterans, isolated from the people that we serve or served? And I mean, the answer is it was hardwired that way by the government when they did away with the draft. Military service used to be a shared experience that was hooked up to basically a mail lottery for families all across the country. And so you wouldn't have to have a conversation like this because everybody knew about that lottery and was living their lives around it, whether they were dodging it or turning up for it or volunteering, because people volunteered even during the time of the draft. A lot of people volunteered. You know, it wasn't like just people waited to be called. The people who were inclined to go went before they got called. But it was a shared experience across all the neighborhoods. Now it's incredible how isolated the two are from each other socially, ideologically, geographically, experientially. And Facebook's kind of good in a way for veterans in that it gives, like you said, units, people who were together and now are scattered across the country, a chance to come together and cluster and talk and share their memories or support each other, check in with each other all the time. It gives broader communities, like within the MOSs, like the EOD techs, they've got more boards than you could believe where they're discussing ordnance and IEDs round the clock. Like if you went to them right now, they'd all be 3 dots, like constant conversation on all these posts, and round the clock, around the world. All that's good, but it's also bad. It's self-isolating. You know, you're just talking to your own. Like the worst invention for human intellect was Google, because you only find what you search for. So you go down your own wormhole. There's no like broad palette coming at you that you're selecting from. You're choosing your own lane. And veterans' life and military life in some ways has become that way. And I take it back to the politicians. They were hardwired for this. This was a way to end protests, and they ended protests. You start the draft again, and it's never going to happen. This is a provocation when I say it, but you start the draft again, right? Which we have about as much chance as we do of like growing tomatoes on the dark side of the moon. It's never going to happen. But you start it again, and these wars will immediately be in a different place in the public discourse. Because when people have to worry about their children or their relatives being called to them, they'll pay attention. And right now, with the all-volunteer force, we've given the American population the luxury of not paying attention to war.
I think we have time for one more question.
So you guys talked a lot about the reverence piece that kind of comes from civilians and how they treat, or how Hollywood, I guess, treats the military experience. And in my experience, veterans and military people in general have a much more irreverent way that they kind of treat their own experiences, and you kind of see that come out in like military meme pages or like Vet TV and stuff like that. But that humor often is a little bit extreme for people that are not necessarily inducted.
A little bit?
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, or very extreme for people who are not inducted. And I was curious, you know, we want to bridge the gap between civilian and military. We've talked about it a lot in these conversations. But how do we take those kind of extreme, humorous experiences and bring that across?
Right.
I never figured that out, because like, let's just talk about the word motherfucker. Right, which everybody uses in the Marine Corps. And I was once with a Marine Corps battalion that I spent a bunch of time with in Iraq, and they were trying to ban the word motherfucker because the Iraqis were hearing them say it. The interpreters are translating it literally.
Oh,
and it's like it has a different meaning. But, right? And now in my current job, if I went around the room, like I could sit down with a Marine, like we could sit down across the table having a meal, and there'll be a salt shaker between us. I'll say, hey, pass me that motherfucker. And all I mean is give me the salt, friend. Right? And he'd give me the thing. If I went into the New York Times and talking like that, I mean, I'm out on the curb, you know, after like a few passes through personnel for the depositions. And
This is being recorded, by the way.
Yeah.
For the New York
no, but I mean,
Times.
but everything in the Marine Corps is like that. I mean, it has its own language, it has its own jargon, it has a gallows humor around violence. You talk about the thing that you're not having in the Marine Corps, which is sex, when you're overseas most of the time. And it gets talked about in a crude way. And that's not new. And it's not, it has nothing to do with politically correct or incorrect. If you go back and read, you know, The Naked and the Dead, I mean, he tried to get the word fuck in repeatedly, and they only let him, he only got F-U-G in past the censors. But it's in the book, and it's like this little wisp of early realism that infected the book. But then if you read like years later when Wartime came out by Paul Fussell, he has an entire chapter dedicated to swearing. He's trying to explain it to people who weren't in the culture, but it's not explicable. And as soon as you walk out of the Marine Corps and like the door clicks behind you and like a different set of lights come on your head, you're like, that was really fucking weird, right? Right? Like we can't act like that out here. But meanwhile in there, they're still doing it. And everyone who went through behind me, and I got out like almost 25 years ago. But I kept toggling back in as a journalist and being around again and seeing how people behaved. I mean, I don't know how you translate that because it really is hard R rating. And like almost every second of it. And I just don't know how you bring that in. Like I had to talk about the book I wrote recently at George Bush's church. And no, it was a very nice crowd, and it was very engaged. But I had to like select pages to read that didn't have swear words on them, and it was damn narrow. Like you know. But
You mean motherfucking narrow?
Yeah. And so I don't. The answer is I don't know because the worlds are so separate, and it's been passed down like that for generations. Like the people in the room who served, they were like the caretakers of this weirdness for a few years. But it predates them by generations.
I'd challenge you a little bit, Chris.
Go ahead.
I'll challenge you a little bit. No, I don't think it's that specific. I really don't. I think that a lot of and I'm Terminal Lance. I'm well versed in all the military social media space.
Wait, you are Terminal Lance?
I am Terminal Lance, the one and only.
I thought you were Max. Regular old Max, it turns out.
My secret identity has been compromised. No, but I don't think that the humor is that different than what anybody else does. I think people just got to write better jokes a lot of the time. I think Terminal Lance has done a pretty good job of bridging a lot of that gap where it's like the humor translates well, and it's about writing stuff that's funny regardless of whether or not you were in the military. You know what I mean? A lot of that stuff is like, I don't know. It's so specific, but it doesn't need to be. And there's ways that you can break the stuff down, but I don't think they try hard enough to do it. I also find that anybody that tends to use the word irreverent a lot is usually like super reverent of whatever they're talking about. They're like, bro, we're so reverent. It's like, no, you're not. You love it. You're like, it's all you think about is you're constantly reverent of her. What are you saying? Like, of course you're not irreverent. Shut up.
Well, I think also the culture breeds being specific. Because if you're not specific, you get dead. You know, if the coordinates aren't exact, things don't go well, right? And I think I was sitting with a military advisor today on something else, and he was a SEAL 6 guy, and we're talking about like how these guys get up the hill, and then they dig a hole, and then they look down the thing, and this. And I wanted to talk about like what are they feeling and what are they and he had so many technical aspects that we needed to talk about that we talked for 2.5 hours about the technical aspects of what needed to be done for this scene to occur that none of the emotional part of it was we couldn't talk about it because it needed to be correct. And I think that that's part of the thing too is like if we can get to the emotional core, if we can look at movies like Fearless, which is fantastic, and pull that over and say, hey, this applies, you know, PTSD is trauma. Everybody, like there's a massive 25% of people walking around have experienced some very traumatic element in their lives. Like it doesn't matter if there were things blowing up or if there was a fire in your house. Like that's trauma. And I think that there are ways to translate it that aren't being engaged because we've got to be so specific about my specific event. And it's like, and then it becomes too technical, and it's not translatable to the masses. And it's about finding a way to speak a language that crosses that, you know, the divide, and finding a way to touch that thing that is most human, that applies to all of the tragedies, that applies to, you know, the oldest stories, and how do we get to the metaphors, and how do we get to back to the stories that resonate for us because they're in our DNA, you know?
I want to say just one really quick thing. I remember when I got out and I was in 3-5, and then I did my Mexico trip, and I stayed in San Diego and went to grad school at San Diego State, and all of my friends were jarheads or surfers, big wave surf bros, and I remember just not having, like, so many women were like, dude, you're an asshole. That's your problem. Because there was just this profanity and just complete absence, just a vacuum of sympathy for any pain another person was feeling. And just, you know, and I remember there was one joke in the grunts, like, have you ever laughed at someone's serious bodily injury? You might be a grunt. And that sort of just complete absence of compassion took me a while to sort of get over. And then eventually I moved and I did grad school up the road at UC Irvine. And I noticed from that stage of my life, I had most of my friends tended to be female at that point. And there was something that happened when I moved from home and was in a different environment. And I remember that, and my grad school mentor was a woman, and remember just my thought process about how you can be intimate and how you can be friends with somebody, and what is the role of male toughness. What does masculinity really amount to at the end of the day if you don't have feelings anymore? If you don't let yourself have feelings, then you're missing out on a huge part of human life. And it took me a while to actually admit that that really sucked, or I'm in pain, or this really hurt. And I wasn't, because in the grunts that you're not really supposed to talk about pain, or you're supposed to suck it up, suck it up, buttercup. So I felt like there was a change that happened for me after a certain point, because I had no empathy for anybody when I got out.
And some of it's also recognizing everybody's different. Like a military unit looks like a bunch of insects at a couple hundred yards, right? Everyone looks the same, but people are different. And like, you don't do journalism, but you do in a way, because you have the Instagram account and the Facebook page, and all these Marines submit to you every day, like dozens of videos, some of which are performative, but some of which are not, or kind of like documentaries. And there was one that I saw.
They're always funny, though.
Yeah, but there was one where this boot PFC, he'd been in the Marine Corps probably like 11 minutes, and he's got a knife.
The mullet?
And he's throwing a knife about 15 feet through the air at like a sheet of plywood with a man-shaped target on it, and it hits it like right in the head, dunk, and it sticks. And if you saw that and you were in the Marine Corps, you'd think, wow, the Marine Corps really teaches people how to throw knives. No, that fucking guy, he was throwing knives at fence posts like his whole childhood. It doesn't have anything to do with the Marine Corps. They don't train you in that.
Yeah.
And, you're watching this, and that's what, like, I came to that conclusion because, like, a lot of Marines, we talk about terminal lance sometimes, former Marines, and I was chatting with one about that video, and he's like, that hillbilly's like half the guys in my platoon. But they were like that before they came in, and the Marine Corps obviously changed them and channeled something in them. But you've got to remember that too, like there's a lot of veterans in this room. You're all different. You have a certain set of similarities, and you may have a lot of common experiences, but you're all different. You're each an individual story or body of stories. And as people who are trying to relate you to the public and translate you and amplify your experiences, it's on us to remember that. I actually have to like know you and what makes you different for your story to resonate with someone, so you're not just an insect.
So we're going to wrap this up now, but we will be out front and hang around. I think Chris might be signing books. And so we welcome you to stick around and meet us out there. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their time tonight.
Thank you to the dog.
Yes.
And that one.
Dog's name?
Both dogs.
What's the dog's name? We're all dying on Tank.
Tank.
Tankity. What?
Do not pet, though. Do not pet. He's going to...
He
looks very excited to be here.
Let us get disconnected. We'll be out in a couple minutes.